Broadway too. I want to welcome all of you to this latest session of a series on a topic that we called third space talent or third space thinking. And this results from 2.5 years of investigation and interviews all around the country, both in Hollywood, but in New York and in Beijing, in Silicon Valley. And there were 2 questions that we asked the more than 100 people that we interviewed. When you hire people, what skills are you looking for? And when you promote them, what skills are you looking for? And why would the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism want to know the answers to those questions? Because we then want to come back to the school, develop courses and other curricula so we can teach that to our students. We already have a great placement rate for our graduates from the Annenberg School, but as the media environment shifts, we know that the skills that our students have also have to shift. And so we identified 5 or 6 of these attributes. I think Jon is probably going to say something about them in his talk. But the purpose of this series has been twofold. One is to drill down into each of the attributes that the folks told us they needed, so that things like empathy and 360-degree thinking and adaptability, et cetera. So we've had speakers, for example, who came in and talked about empathy and creativity from a neuroscience point of view, which is sort of the depth part. Then we had people like John Robertson, who came in from the company UPS to talk about how they think about these things, not just in the vertical, but across the board. In fact, John is with us. I'd just like if he would just wave his hand. He's come all the way from the corporate world and all the way from down the peninsula, I guess, to visit with us. And so we've had wonderful guests from Disney, as well as from the Academy, from Korn Ferry, et cetera. It gives me a great deal of pleasure today to introduce one of our Annenberg faculty, who's one of our leading faculty in the communications management program and in other teaching programs here at the university. He has a very third spacey kind of background, which means he's worked as an investment banker, he's worked as a producer, he's been a teacher, he's been an advisor, he was Bob Dylan's road manager. Bob Dylan was a singer for many of you in the room who don't remember. And so he's really led this and been involved in a third space approach to the world. And what Jon is going to do today, I think, is provide us with a very interesting and different take on third space thinking, because we've tended to concentrate on the skills and the skill attributes, which are very important. How should we teach them? How should we research them? Jon, I think, is going to bring in the ethical and more moral perspective, which is also hugely important for what we want to convey to our students. We want Annenberg students not only to be well trained in a technical sense, but have a sense of empathy for the world, to be ethical, to have a moral sense. And that's harder to teach. It's one of the soft skills, but it's one of the most important skills, one of the most important values that we can teach to our students. So Jon is someone who has done the sort of high-tech financial piece, but he's not going to talk about that today. He's really going to concentrate on those attributes which are sometimes left behind, especially, well, I won't give the punchline away, Jon, but let's thank Jon Taplin and welcome him to the podium. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. When Ernie first drew on his whiteboard in his office, and I've kind of tried to recreate it over there, this notion that there were these 2 big things that universities teach pretty well: technology, engineering, and then business. And, you know, having spent 6 years at Merrill Lynch as a Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions for Media. I'm well aware of the kind of masters of the universe way of looking at the world that comes from investment bankers. And it's not Thirdspace, I tell you. And now, obviously, whereas 10 years ago, everybody wanted to become an investment banker. Now, everybody wants to become Jeff Zucker. They want to become a tech mogul. And my worry is that maybe some of those same skills are missing in the technology field. So what I'm going to talk to you about comes from the point of view of somebody who spent the first 30 years of his life making movies, music, TV shows, and then spent the last 20 years of his life in the technology business. First as the CEO of a company called Entertainer, which was the first online video on demand platform. One of my colleagues from Entertainer is here, Bob Tapiro. And then the last 12 years of my life here at Annenberg, and the last 5 years of my life running the Annenberg Innovation Lab. So I come at this with two feelings, one of which is huge optimism, because I believe that the technological world does provide a more democratic platform for people to get their content out. But I also come at it with a sense of, I would say, humility. Because if you start a online broadband video on demand company in 1996, you eventually learn about humility, right? So in thinking about this, I came across a speech that Martin Luther King gave at the National Cathedral in March of 1968. So this is 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And the speech was called "Staying Awake in a Revolution." And King used the trope of Rip Van Winkle. And Rip Van Winkle goes up the mountain, passes this tavern with a picture of King George III on the side of it, goes up the mountain and falls asleep for 20 years. And he comes back down the mountain 20 years later, and there's a sign with George Washington's picture on the tavern. And he goes crazy. And he thinks everybody else is crazy. But actually, he just slept through the revolution. And so King said, too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, yet they fail to develop the new attitudes that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. And what I want to ask you today is, who's asleep and who's awake in this technological revolution that King was describing? In other words, the whole basis of his speech was, in 1968, we were about to embark on a technological revolution. So what was the technological revolution in 1968? Well, I would argue it was very, very countercultural. This is a picture of Stuart Brand and Ken Kesey. For those of you young people here who don't know who Ken Kesey was, he did the acid trips in San Francisco. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He was an extraordinarily countercultural phenomenon, and Stuart Brand created the Whole Earth catalog. And they created a network called WELL, the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which was, for all intents and purposes, the first internet, the first connected network. And that network was built on the basis of some work that the federal government had spent through a program called ARPANET. And this is literally the napkin that Ernie's and my friend Vince Cerf drew the early design of the internet on. And the whole idea of this was that we would go from a centralized network, the TV that we had all lived with one broadcasting to many, to a decentralized network, to eventually a totally distributed network. And as Nick Negroponte, who was the head of the MIT Media Lab, said, we will decentralize control and harmonize people That was the whole mission of the internet. So 20 years later, a group of young people came out of Stanford, out of both the business school and the computer science program, led by a young man named Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel started a magazine called the Stanford Review, and this was a radical libertarian magazine. Peter Thiel believed that companies should set up on platforms offshore outside the 20-mile limit so they were not in control of any government. He eventually took it to the point of the Free Cities movement, which Larry Page, who's the CEO of Google, joined in, which was that cities should be owned by people, and so they would be outside of the range of governmental power. Ayn Rand was their goddess, and they took Ayn Rand's basic thesis which was the question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. And this libertarian thesis is essentially the core of what the internet economy has become. Peter Thiel's first company out of Stanford was PayPal. PayPal was an attempt to set up a currency that was outside of the realm of banking. And the PayPal mafia, as they came to be called, all of them, you notice, men, now basically run Silicon Valley. They run LinkedIn, they run Yelp, they run YouTube, they run basically every company in Silicon Valley. And they're all radical libertarians. And they have all taken this thesis, notice Uber, the question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me. So this was a radically different notion. And Thiel had 4 basic ideas. That the internet should be a space in which there is no regulation, where there are no taxes. Remember, Jeff Bezos built a company that had extraordinary competitive advantage over a local bookstore because he didn't have to pay any taxes. And he built it for 15 years on no taxes. They didn't believe in copyright. They thought copyright was not important. And they didn't believe in competition, and you'll see where that goes. They also had a problem with women. The term mansplaining comes directly from the problem that libertarians have with women. And as Thiel said in a conversation at the Cato Institute, the extension of welfare and franchise to women in the 1920s has rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. He said this. And what did he mean by that? He basically meant that women are takers and men are makers, and so therefore women shouldn't get to vote. Just like people on welfare shouldn't get to vote. They're all takers and not makers. And this is an Ayn Rand thesis. So what worries me? What worries me is that we're entering into an age of what I call technodeterminism. That the whole way the world is going to flow from here on out is already determined. And you basically have to get on the boat or get off the boat. And so there has begun to be a pushback against this. And I hope my voice will be part of that pushback. A book called Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class by Scott Timberg, which was published 2 months ago, and a book by our friend Ethan Zuckerman called Rewire, which was published about a year ago. Ethan says, it's obvious now that what we did was a fiasco, so let me remind you that what we wanted to do was something brave and noble. And so what does he mean by that? What he means was that the idea that the whole internet should be based around the idea of companies, very large companies, spying on you in order to sell you stuff was not the idea that Vint Cerf, Tim Berners-Lee, any of those people who created the internet, John Seeley Brown, had. That was not their idea. But that's what it's turned into. So what has this done for the creative class? Here we are at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism, and we are hoping to train a generation of leaders to run the communications companies of the future, to run the journalism companies of the future. So what happened? Well, this is the music business. As you can see, in 2000, it peaked out, and it has been straight downhill ever since. It doesn't matter, all the addition of Spotify, everything else made no difference whatsoever. It's been downhill. This is the newspaper business. 2000, again, is the top. $65 billion worth of advertising in newspapers in year 2000. Today, it's under 17 billion. This is the book business since the invention of the Kindle. Straight downhill. And this is the movie business since the real onslaught of broadband and piracy. So it's not like people stopped watching movies, listening to music, reading the news, reading books. It's just that we somehow societally decided to make a wholesale reallocation of money from people who made content, who own content, to people who owned platforms. And these platforms are all monopolies. As Peter Thiel says, competition is for losers. If you want to create and capture lasting value, look to build a monopoly. So Google has been very successful in building a monopoly. They have 80% of the search business. Amazon has been very successful in building a monopoly. They have no competition in the online retail of books business. Apple and Google basically create a duopoly to split the mobile payments, mobile everything business, whether iOS or Android, they split it. So once in a while, we get a chance to see this monopoly exposed. So on November 11th last year, for 1 hour and a half, Google's ad server went down, the DoubleClick ad server. And 80% of the ads on the major sites in America disappeared. 80%. It gives you an idea of how powerful Google is in the advertising. And now we have a new player, Facebook. And as Justin Smith, the CEO of Bloomberg, says, the list is a lot longer than is publicly known of those sites that have Facebook delivering half to 2/3 of their traffic today. Now we know those sites include BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, but ironically it also includes the New York Times, BBC, CNN, all that. And as you saw yesterday, Facebook now announces they're going to just put the news right in Facebook and cut out the people. So again, new monopolists. And then we have broadband, of which there is a huge fight, which the Innovation Lab is involved in, over who controls the pipe to the home. And so if you want 25 megabits per second, which as far as I'm concerned is table stakes. Every student in this school gets 100 megabits per second broadband. So if you want 25 megabits per second, 75% of Americans have one choice. That's a monopoly. If you want 50 megabits, 84% of Americans have one choice. Now, there's one other place where the money went. It went into the pockets of criminals like this. This is Kim.com, and he was the proprietor owner of Megaupload. So Kim made $450 million in 4 years until Megaupload was shut down, selling advertisements against content which he had no right to put up on his site. All of it stolen. He didn't give one penny to a musician, to a filmmaker, to anybody on that. He invested in yachts, private airplanes, Mercedes-Benz, mansions all over the world. That's what he did. Now, how did people find Kim.com? Through Google. So I just put watch Harry Potter online free into my Google search engine. And here are 24 pirate sites that I can get to directly from Google. And as you can see over there, Popcorn Time, which is the largest pirate site of all, has just as much traffic on the Google search engine as does Netflix. I have one other problem. Abe Lincoln said the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and yet Google believes that ISIS and Anwar al-Awlaki have free speech rights to put as many videos advocating death to Americans up on YouTube as they want. They even go so far as to sell Bounty paper towels on the front of a ISIS video. That's pretty ballsy. Now, Google has lots of tools for YouTube for content owners to trace content that is theirs, to issue takedown orders. But they never use those tools on the upload side. In other words, those same tools could be used to block Anwar al-Awlaki's videos or to block illegal content before it ever got uploaded. But Google would rather you play whack-a-mole with them. They'd rather be able to sell Bounty paper towels against the ISIS videos until you get it taken down. So Niels Gilman, who's the Associate Chancellor of UC Berkeley, says our basic problem in America is a twin insurgency. From below comes a series of interconnected criminal insurgencies that root around states, seek ways to empower and enrich themselves in the shadows of the global economy. That's the Kim.coms and the ISISes of the world. And from above comes the plutocratic insurgency, in which globalized elites seek to disengage from traditional national obligations and responsibilities. That's Peter Thiel. He's in the Forbes 400 top 25, and he doesn't believe he has any obligation to anybody. So we know what below looks like. We all saw that 3 guys in a room somewhere in Russia or China or North Korea could bring down a $50 billion corporation called Sony. Bring it to its knees. And now we are rapidly embracing the Internet of Things, in which we will then manage to get you so wired up and so connected that you will have no privacy anywhere. And by the way, 60 Minutes did a brilliant piece 4 weeks ago, shows that you could hack into any one of these modern connected cars, into a Lexus, a Mercedes-Benz, and drive it into a wall from a computer, miles away. So, like everything, we're always embracing the shiny new object, the Internet of Things, but we never think about the security part of it until afterwards. That's an afterthought. And from above, well, here's the biggest financier of the libertarian movement, the Koch brothers. They're going to spend $900 million next year to ensure that their view of no taxes, no regulation gets into the White House. And of course, Google spends millions of dollars a year lobbying in Washington, and hardly any politician will come out against them. So sometimes when I talk about this, my students say, well, it's a bunch of journalists or a bunch of musicians. Why should we care about them? They're not really important, but I want you to know that the technology revolution is coming for all of your jobs. This is a chart from The Economist in which they said that the chance that your job will be taken by a robot in up to 30 or 40 job categories is very high. And Stuart Sanford at Cornell, the computer science department, notes that robots, like Moore's law, happen on an exponential curve. So the number of robots is doubling every 30 months. So we don't feel it right now because we're right in here. But starting around 2025, all of a sudden it's going to become killer. And at some point, he estimates by 2035, there will be more robots than people. And how we deal with that is something that nobody is talking about. So I want to ask the question, is this brilliant technological revolution actually bringing us progress? So in 1929, just before the crash of the stock market, the top 1% earned 23.9% of all income in the United States. And then because of a bunch of changes in taxes, regulations, that came all the way down to 8.9% in 1975. But starting in the Reagan Revolution and starting with that dark section, which is the technology revolution, returns to capital increased radically. And now we're right back up to where we were just before the crash of the stock market. The top 1% earned 23.9% of the income. Now, what this chart shows is that productivity, which continued to increase in the computer revolution, stopped making returns to the average laborer. This is median wage, and in 1980, it just stopped. All the returns went to capital. And I put this other chart down there kind of interestingly because productivity has, in the last 4 years, come to a decline. And the International Journal of Management Economics surmises that maybe that is because your employees are spending more time on Facebook than they actually are doing their work, and so maybe that's not helping productivity. So here's the biggest problem. As our colleague Bob Scheer has pointed out, the unprecedented liberating power of the supercomputer combined with the worldwide internet contains the seeds of freedom's destruction. You don't have any privacy, get over it. Anybody who's carrying a smartphone has a microphone on it that can be turned on by the NSA remotely. So just forget about your notion that you have privacy. And I put this little Fitbit up there because we recently talked to some people in a health insurance company, and they basically said, look, we love these personal fitness monitors. In fact, we may require people to wear them. And that's how we will set your insurance rates. Because we want to know if your heartbeat is erratic or something, and that will tell us in real time all the time. Now, the libertarians say, hey, man, the social media revolution has revolutionized the world. It brought us the Arab Spring. I was with Tom Friedman last week. He said, total nonsense. This is Freedom House's improvements or declines in freedom since 2004 to the present day. And as you can see, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And why is it getting worse? 2 reasons. One, in Russia and in China and in Iran and in Venezuela, the state still controls television. And television as a propaganda tool is actually better than Twitter. It overwhelms Twitter. Even if you can get Twitter, which you can't get in China and a lot of other places. And the second thing is that even if you have social media in Iran, the government can use it to spy on you and jail you, as we've found in many, many countries. So if Martin Luther King is right that we're asleep, or at least some of us, I know that Mark Zuckerberg is not asleep. I know that Larry Page is not asleep. I know that Peter Thiel is not asleep. But I surmise that a lot of us are because we don't really understand what's going on. And if he's right, then I'm brought back to one of my favorite books from the 30s, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which he surmised that in this era, we would take a combination of drugs. He had this drug called Soma, which was kind of a combination of Viagra and Prozac, and everybody would have to take it. And we would have this enveloping entertainment, which he called the feelies, which we would be so turned on to that we wouldn't even notice that our freedom, our policies were out of our control, that we wouldn't have any sense of what was going on. And so Yuval Noah Harari from Hebrew University says, under different titles, different headings, you see more and more people spending more and more time or solving their inner problems with drugs and computer games, both legal drugs and illegal drugs. So we all know the amount of opioids that are on the street is going through the roof. We all know that the amount of people taking SSRIs is going through the roof. And we also know that we have new enveloping video games that are getting deeper and deeper. And last week, Chris Sullentrop, who writes about video games in the New York Times, says he went around and interviewed all the people who are doing virtual reality. And you guys all know what virtual reality is. You put a helmet on and you're in the room. And he said the consensus among the developers was the killer app was virtual reality porn. Here's the first beginnings of that. You know, so get ready for that to keep you asleep or something. Tom Friedman's colleague, David Brooks, has a theory which he calls Colosseum culture. And that is the ability for all of us to turn thumbs down on somebody. So we can destroy Brian Williams, Bill Cosby, whoever, in a week. Their life is over. And Francois Barr, my colleague, and I did a survey on Twitter usage during the presidential race of 2012. And they built a dashboard where you could see the 10 most negative tweets on Romney or the 10 most negative tweets on Obama. And it got to the point that I couldn't look at it anymore. It was so racist, especially around Obama. It was so horrible and racist. And why is that? It's because of anonymity. So Plato had this theory called the ring of Gyges, which was you would put this ring on and you would disappear. And what would your behavior become like if you could disappear? Well, his thesis was your behavior would be much worse. You would steal, you would lie, you would go sleep with your best friend's wife, you know, whatever. And that's what's happening. And even on this campus, we have this new platform called Yik Yak, in which you can anonymously shame somebody with no consequences. So I'm not sure this is a good thing. Here's another problem. This is called fear of missing out. There's a certain kind of anxiety. You walk down the streets here and kids have got their face buried in a smartphone. They run into you, they run into a fire hydrant, whatever. 300 hours of YouTube video are uploaded every single minute of every single day, 24/7, 365 days a year. How could you ever keep up with that? You will always miss out. So George Akerlof, who's an economist at Berkeley, has a thesis. He calls it the market for lemons. And the thesis is that nobody will ever pay a premium for a used car. If you don't know what the worth of something is, then you assume it's crap. And so you will never pay a premium. My thesis is that's what's happening in YouTube. We watch the advertising rates of YouTube continually go down. And people like Maker Studios or Machinima, who were making really good money 2 years ago, are barely squeaking by today. And as you can see, most of YouTube videos are seen by less than 100 people. Only a tiny, tiny fraction, 0.33, 1/3 of 1%, are seen by more than 1 million people. The other problem we have in terms of the entertainment business is that we're living in a winner-takes-all society. So this is the download business in 2011 in the music business. So 80% of the downloads went to 1% of the content. That is, Jay-Z and Beyonce made out like bandits, and the average middle-class musician could not make a living. And as Princeton guys, Dodds and Watts said, popularity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can get your video promoted on Spotify or on Google early on, then it rises to the top of the stack, and then you hit the first thing on the stack, and then it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. So what is the artist to do? Well, a lot of people tell us that the only solution is advertising. So Jay-Z, as if he doesn't have enough money, becomes a shill for Budweiser. And I can put my Coca-Cola ads in any TV show. Product placement becomes everywhere. And even in the august field of journalism, a publication like The Atlantic uses what they call native advertising, which means I cannot tell what is a paid-for piece of content and what is actually produced by The Atlantic unless I read the really fine print. So I want to end by asking a question. What is liberty? The libertarians claim that all they want is liberty. But is that the same liberty that Thomas Jefferson talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? This is a book called Hooked. And it's a book that teaches you how to build an addictive app like Snapchat. And the writer has a very clear matrix of how you do that. You have a trigger, and then you have an action, and then you get a reward, and then you invest yourself back in the platform. And I was really reminded of Psych 101, which is exactly what we did to the mouse, right? And it works. But is the kid who is looking at Snapchat 4 hours a day, is that person free? Does that person have agency? Or is that person addicted? I am more interested in what it means to be human. This is what Epicurus, my favorite philosopher, the Greek, says, what it means to be human. The company of good friends, the freedom and autonomy to enjoy meaningful work. Is that slipping away? If the robots take over your job, are you going to have freedom and autonomy to enjoy meaningful work? And the willingness to live an examined life with a core faith or philosophy. I think that's really critical. This is not a philosophy. This is Ayn Rand's view of freedom, to ask nothing, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing. So this brings me to what role we need to play. You know, what I worry most of all, that a university like this becomes a vocational school for the Shark Tank. We're just going to prepare you to enter into the Shark Tank. And we forget what the humanities were really for, which were to tell you something about how you live a life. And so Ernie's Thirdspace Competencies are really built around trying to make you think about being culturally competent. 360-degree thinking, how you're adaptable, intellectual curiosity, empathy. All of these are critical points in figuring out how you live a life in the future. And if we lose these things, we will send ourselves into a techno-deterministic future that, to me, will be bad for the society, but more often it will be horrible for people who want to make creative content. Now, I also think there's a role for government. Now, obviously, already, as you know, the FCC committed to net neutrality and committed to allowing municipal utilities to deploy fiber to the home 3 weeks ago. And already they've been sued by the big cable companies, the big telephone companies. And this is going to be a battle in which this is going to go on for a while. And we need to be on the side of understanding that if a very small number of companies control your access to content, that is not a good thing. And that's exactly what's happened. And so I want to think about maybe a digital renaissance. I was lucky enough to be involved at the tail end of the last American Renaissance. I worked for Bob Dylan, the band. I worked for Martin Scorsese. I built and created products. So, you know, if you think about what happened in the United States from 1935 to 1975, an extraordinary explosion of creative energy came out, whether it's Jackson Pollock reinventing what art was, or Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker reinventing how you made music, or whether it's Bob Dylan and the Freedom Riders, or Orson Welles really rethinking the movie business, or Elvis Presley, or Billie Holiday, or Marty Scorsese, or Francis Coppola. There was unbelievable originality coming out of these people. And so what could be the trigger for this next renaissance? So The Economist says that there will be 5 billion smartphones by, they say 2020, the folks at Facebook say 2017. So you have a single device connected to a single network all around the world. And so if I could sell something for 50 cents to just 2% of that audience, that would be $50 million. I don't have to be in the mass media business. I can be in the micro-targeting business. And I can make a really good living in that business. But this will not work if all content is out there for free, and I can't compete with free, even at 50 cents. So I've studied over the last 3 years the Renaissance, the original Renaissance in Florence in 1480, and the Renaissance that I was able to participate in the United States. And I think there are a few conditions that make it happen. So one is that originality is valued above all. But we also reference the past. So this is not a sequel culture. The problem with the movie business today, it's all about sequels. There's no originality whatsoever. Everything, we're at Spider-Man 8 now, are we at Avengers 6? I don't know. I don't really care. But we also, you know, if you think about Eric Clapton referenced Muddy Waters. I mean, we also look, Elvis Presley referenced, you know, Big Boy Crudup. So that's one thing. Second is, as Culture Crash has pointed out, wide-scale participation. That means not just that journalists get to work and make a living, but that all the associated trades that are involved with that get employment. I mean, I was lucky enough to be a road manager in the music business. I was one of the outliers. I was just, you know, one of the associated trades. But that's important, that these businesses, these creative businesses, have lots of other businesses that are around them. And in Renaissance Italy, there were guys who were stone polishers and guys who were canvas stretchers and all that. Everybody's in. The third thing is that we really believe, and Francois is doing a lot of work in this, is that physical proximity is important. This is not just a virtual world. We got to be in a room together, talking together. We got to be able to buff off each other. And literally, Leonardo could walk down the street to Michelangelo's studio. And that was part of the deal. They were competitive, but they were also supportive. And I saw that in the music business, and I saw that in the film business. a robust marketplace, and that means a fair marketplace where journalists get paid, not allowing Ariana Huffington put your thing on her and she sells all the advertising, but you actually get paid. And finally, a patronage system, because not everything is based on commercial value. You know, Jackson Pollock would not have existed if Peggy Guggenheim hadn't been his patron and said, look, this is really weird stuff, but I think this is cool, and I'm going to buy some. And that made his life possible. So I just want to finish by saying, here's some ideas. As I said at the beginning, I have no idea if I've got the answers to this. I don't even think I do. But some of the things I think could help spur this renaissance would be this. So an open 1 gigabit per second symmetrical network with multiple providers in every city. So competition and speed. That's something we could make happen. I have no doubt about that. I was at the FCC last week. They don't have any doubt about it. Network neutrality. So if there are some natural monopolies, which maybe there are, that only a few people will have the wire into your house, they can't be a block to Mauricio's programming getting out to anybody. Antitrust enforcement. As we saw last week, the people at Google, the people at the FTC, the staff said Google should be stopped. They are clearly using their market power to squeeze other people. And for political reasons, whatever, they didn't bring an enforcement action. And that's disgusting. And look, I know Eric Schmidt spends a lot of time at the White House, but that shouldn't be a factor as to why these things happen. Protection of copyright, so the middle-class creative worker could make a living. I think it's absolutely critical. And if we don't start figuring out how to do that. Next, a vital public broadcasting system. Ernie spent a lot of his life trying to make that happen. And he and I both know that NPR is in pretty good shape, but PBS is probably completely screwed up. But it could be better. It could be better. And a broadband system, and this would be essentially the national patron. We've seen how the BBC works, and a lot of it doesn't have to do with what's the commerciality. And finally, a global micropayment system, because if I'm going to sell something for 25 cents on the internet, I do not want Visa taking 21 cents of that 25 cents. I just end with this vision from Dr. King from that same speech. Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. Thank you very much.
Wow. Questions? Please identify yourself just to let Jon know who you are, and he will respond accordingly. Mr. Mota.
My name is Marisa Mota. I'm a TV, movie content producer based here in LA. Jon, first, that was an amazing presentation. I really liked it. You thought I wouldn't like it, but I really liked it. Because we have fought before in the past about similar issues, but it's very scary. It's a very scary presentation. It's hard to keep being optimistic about the future, but it's a very provoking content. So I understand I understand here who is the new man, who is the new enemy, but I just feel that we're just changing. I feel that the roles, we also had triple dippers. These new guys, they're just triple dippers, but we also, the media companies have been amazing triple dippers. They always want to make as much as possible out of copyright, of the creator and all that. So I just wanted to hear from you, what is the difference between the PayPal mafia and, because now tech moguls, for me tech moguls and media moguls are very similar. Being the grandson of the Brazilian Shakespeare, my grandfather was ripped by a media mogul, and he never saw the color, but he had a salary and all that. So how do you see the difference between those two
Okay.
players?
So I actually think that the media business, let's say CBS, NBC, Fox, or a lot of those businesses are extremely competitive businesses. There's lots of players, and they're all fighting for market share. Whereas Google, Facebook are monopolies, and that's a big difference. You know, the French have a term, rentier, which means a rent taker. And that's what these guys are. They have total monopoly access. Facebook has monopoly access to 1,500,000 people. You know, and they're going to charge a rent, whether it's to an advertiser or to a content provider. And so that to me is different than the business that they're in. So that's one aspect. The second thing is, I do realize that on some level, there are natural monopolies. You know, I mean, Ernie and I are old enough to remember the Bell system. And that was a regulated monopoly. We do not have regulated monopolies anymore. We have unregulated monopolies. So a regulated monopoly was told, the Bell system told, you have to spend 14% of your profits on research and development. And so they created Bell Labs. And out of Bell Labs, we've got the solar cell, the microprocessor, the cellular network, the satellite. We got basically everything that we live with in the modern age was invented at Bell Labs and given incredibly cheaply to the rest of the country to go and deploy those patents. So that, and by the way, they didn't spend any money on advertising. And you can't open the New York Times without having a full-page ad from Verizon and a full-page ad from AT&T selling a commodity product, pretending that one is better than the other. So today, AT&T spends 20% of its revenues on advertising and 1% of its revenues on research and development, and it used to be just the opposite. Yeah.
So, I'm pretty overwhelmed and taken aback by what you said because it was great and it hit. Gary Wexler, I'm an adjunct professor here. Is that a good identity?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyway, the big conversation has been in the world now about technology and how it's changing everything and opening up new ideas and new opportunities. You just introduced a revolutionary counter conversation to this. How big do you think this conversation is going to get?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I obviously, I think that there's a huge amount of power at Google and Facebook and to push back. And, but, you know, there's some really simple things Google could do. Google could make it impossible for ISIS to upload videos to YouTube, really easily. You know, Google could make it impossible for you to see Kim.com's pirate site. Be really simple. They could do all sorts of things. Now they use, you know, I love that phrase from Abraham Lincoln. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. They use the First Amendment, and the New York Times had a story about this last week. That the First Amendment is now not used by, you know, student activists. It's used by corporations to say they have the right to do whatever they want to do, and they call it free speech. Well, why does Google want to do that? Because it wants to keep selling advertising, whether it's on ISIS videos or on copyrighted content that they don't have any right to. YouTube has every single song in the whole universe on YouTube. Every single song. And they sell advertising against that. And the artists get, some of them get some of it, but a tiny fraction of it. And most artists don't get anything from it because it's just some kid posting it and YouTube selling against it. So, I mean, I think it's an important conversation. And I quite frankly think that if this school pretends that it's going to produce the next generation of journalists, if the advertising of the journalism of the newspaper business went from 68 billion to 17 billion in 4 years. What the hell? I mean, how are they going to afford to pay for our students to be?
Now, could you say a little bit about
Come sit
what,
over here.
what we could do? What can teachers do? What should we be teaching that we're not teaching now so that the next generation of American citizens and economic actors can get away from this dystopian future and something that, if it's not utopian, at least is not going to continue that trend. So what should we be doing in the university?
Well, I mean, the first thing I think is that somehow we've got to get young people to understand that there are whole creative businesses that are at risk in this new world. And that, look, we all like the shiny new toy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the shiny new toy that has incredible privacy problems around it or incredible problems around artists getting paid, whether that's a good thing. And so this notion, for instance, that nobody should pay for content is, to me, an anathema. That nobody should pay for journalism, nobody should pay for music, nobody should pay for movies. I mean, now, I don't know how we teach that, but that's one thing. And the second thing is just basically trying to push back on a public policy basis against a very small number of companies which are controlling the new world. And there's really only 4 or 5 of them. And their control is only going to get deeper. I mean, that statistic I showed about the percentage of views on news sites coming from Facebook is astonishing. And so if you understand that these companies are monopolies, then there ought to be a role for regulation. Now, Ernie, you spent a lot of time in Washington, and for some reason, the antitrust business, they're out of business. And I don't know why that is. And it's not the fault of the Republicans or the Democrats. They're both equally guilty at being in the bag for big money. And so nobody wants to bust these firms. And these firms are changing the nature of what it means to be a creative person in America. Yeah.
Elliot Rausch.
Hold on.
Elliot Rausch, filmmaker. Thank you, Jonathan. For the little sheep over here on this side of the room, getting ready for the slaughter. How important, I think, just as we're surviving through this, I mean, we could probably all confess to becoming addicted and having probably some of our neurology, changing form. Many of us have discussions about physical ailment or anxiety or depression connected with the amount of distraction and the inability to be present. On a grassroots level, just as a survival mechanism, how important is mindfulness going to be, or some kind of, physical revolt?
Well, one of the things that I hope that we kind of expand out this notion of the third space is that to be empathetic is to be present. And we all have been in meetings with people when 2/3 of the people are on their damn cell phone. And, I mean, I got to the point in my classes where I said you could not have an open laptop in my classes. And there was a lot of pushback, and I got rated as a mean professor on Rate My Professor and everything. But the point is, how can you be present if you're spending your time on Facebook while I'm trying to impart some knowledge to you? So, I mean, I think the mindfulness thing is a real issue. And look, we know that people are getting better and better at building addictive apps. We know it's working. We know the time spent on social media networks is getting longer, not shorter. And by the way, for producers of TV, that's probably a big problem. Because if you're spending, 3 hours a day on Facebook, you're not watching TV. Or if you are watching TV, you're not paying any attention to it. It's just on in the background. So, we've watched, I have some other presentations in which the amount of time and the amount of money that people who are selling advertising-supported TV are losing, it's down, it's like down 12 to 14% year over year. The amount of people watching, Nickelodeon or watching MTV or watching that kind of stuff. And that's why, Viacom laid off 2,000 people last week. So, this is a crisis. And the problem for me is nobody's paying much attention. That's why you want to use that trope, sleep. And quite frankly, my minister, who you've met, says, look, it's not just drugs, it's everything. Quite frankly, people are using lots of ways to avoid paying attention, to keep themselves asleep. They're borrowing from their homes and pretending they're making money. That's not income, that's debt. They're doing all sorts of things to keep from thinking about what's really going on. And so that to me is problematic. And I think, some kind of sense of mindfulness is really important to that.
Let's take maybe 2 more questions, and we'll have to bring it to an end.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a film director as well. My question is about patronage and like a public television system. I feel like as a filmmaker, you kind of need to. There's like a necessary evil to produce, these commercial content pieces and TV
Right.
spots. And in other countries like England, Canada, New Zealand, they have these grants and all these great things for kind of what you mentioned about originality being,
Right.
Prominent and paramount. So what can America do to kind of get on that same page? And it just seems kind of ironic that we're the country influencing so many others, and they're just trying to get on our same page, but at the same time, we're all getting,
Right.
screwed over.
So I totally agree. Look, I have a very good friend named David Fanning who runs a show called Frontline. So he told me that, and Ernie would know this better than me, but of the money the federal government gives to public broadcasting, to PBS, most of it goes to supporting 400 stations around the country. Very little of it goes to people who are making programming.
And 80% of that goes to 4 producing stations.
Right.
And the other get $20 to do something else.
Right. So that's insane. First off, PBS doesn't need 400 stations. It needs a single broadcasting signal. Everyone's, what it is the Local Station Preservation Act. This congressman will vote for PBS funding so the little podunk station in his town will stay in business. For what reason? We're in a world of 90% of the people get their content from cable or satellite anyway, so we're running 400, and by the way, NBC only has 110 affiliates, so there's no reason.
But imagine if you turned it upside down and said, yes, we do want 400 places around the country where citizens can come in and learn how to produce content on their own, to tell the local stories. But the way the thing is structured, it's very top-down. It's the producing stations in New York and Boston and San Francisco, 80%. But if we re-envision public broadcasting, then it becomes a place where local directors in Iowa or Kansas or Oakland get to learn how to produce content, and then it gets curated.
But Ernie, we could do that in a storefront in Culver City. We don't need a huge broadcasting facility and all that. We could do it in a storefront and broadband. the waste of money on, and maybe that's another issue that we ought to be dealing with here. I mean, God knows we have the expertise. We have Mark Lloyd. We have you, me. I mean, you know, maybe that's one of the ways. Because I agree with you in the sense of, I think patronage, in other words, a system of production of content that is not connected to getting craft foods to say this is good, would be a helpful thing. And I think it's ironic that I'm talking to you guys who are killer ad directors, you know, to say that, but that's really would be a helpful thing. And you guys all know how to produce these incredibly cool videos that have, you don't have any sponsor at all. You just put them out on Vimeo.
And so I'd like to encourage at least one of our students here to ask a question. So if we...
No pressure.
No pressure.
It's the dean's thing.
But you'll flunk if you don't... I'll call on people if they don't volunteer. Against the... I got you last time. I busted you last time. So
Come on.
the two... Are you a student?
Yes.
Okay, and you're a student? Okay, I want questions from over here. Top-down, authoritarian pedagogy.
I'm actually taking Professor Taplin's class this semester. And
No, it's okay.
he gave the presentation
I want to hear from her.
in our class
Oh.
at the beginning of the semester, and I really enjoyed it. So my question is, so Annenberg, in this digital age and this digital revolution, Annenberg is teaching students tremendously about how we could adjust to this digital revolution. So what's your suggestions on students who would like to explore in this new world, but who also want to get meaningful work like the period like the 1930s to the 1970s?
Right. Well, you know, one of the things I keep hoping for is that I begin to see some really original work online. And that's how, you know, and quite frankly, there are two people here in the room who've actually achieved that. Marisa Mota, who makes a series called Esau's High, and Elliot Rausch. I haven't seen your French stuff, but Elliot has stuff. If you just go to Elliot Rausch online, you'll see some of the most beautiful films that you can imagine, and they're just there, you know? And so I think it's still possible to produce great stuff. Now, granted, he has money from a company, Hulu, and he has money because he makes advertising and gets to have a hobby. And so we all have to figure out how to do that, right? I mean, and, you know, that's not bad. You know, Andy Warhol used to be a window dresser for Bonwit Teller, right? And then he would go home at night and paint. So, you know, we all have to figure out, make our compromises to get to make the content we make. So, I don't know. I think you just have to try and make good stuff. And as I say to you in class, the one thing we don't want to do is don't make junk. You know, don't make honey boo-boo. Don't get involved in because it's just, there's too much junk out in the world anyway, and it's just clogging up our brains.
Ending on the note of high quality and risk-taking and empathy and intellectual curiosity and all that other stuff, I want to do two things. I want to, first of all, thank Jon Taplin for a very, not surprisingly for those of us who know Jon Taplin, a very productive and forward-looking presentation. So thank you, Jon. The second is I want to invite you to our next presentation. I think where are you, Chantal? We have two coming up. One is, I think the last one is on intellectual curiosity that Casey Cole is going to be doing on April 30th. And John Boudreau, who is coming from the business school and who is an expert on kind of talent and creativity and how that intersects with HR, with human relations, with how you actually get hired, is going to come and talk to us where the kind of the ideal meets the practical. And when is that?
Next Thursday, April 9th.
Okay, April 9th, same spot, same station. Please come back, tell your friends about us. April 2nd, yes. And thank you. Go forth and apply.